If this version of the code were to become law, it would give us no real choice but to stop making Google search available in Australia.
Australia makes our rules for things you can do in Australia. That's done in our parliament, it's done by our government, and that's how things work here in Australia. And people who want to work with that in Australia, you're very welcome. But we don't respond to threats.
The world will be watching carefully because what happens in Australia could set a precedent for other countries.
The Australian government is moving forward with legislation that would force Google and Facebook to share revenue with news media outlets in Australia. France has recently enacted similar but more lenient legislation. The US, Spain and Germany have also considered action, and Canada has stated that they will be following the situation in Australia very closely. The matter has gotten serious enough that Google has threatened to pull its search services out of Australia entirely.
The sharp reaction wasn't just from Scott Morrison against Google. We heard from lawmakers who called the threat to pull out from Australia, blackmailing. Some called it the big companies bullying democracy.
The government and the media corporations are saying that Google is unfairly profiting off news content, using it to dominate the digital advertising market and forcing a devastating decline in the viability of journalism around the world. But Google says that the vast majority of its revenue comes from non-news related searches. It doesn't show ads on its news tab, and ads surrounding links to news on its main search platform are exceedingly rare. Therefore, Google says that it does very little to prevent news outlets from monetizing. On the contrary, they state that they actually drive more than 24 billion visits towards news sites every month. So, is this a matter of big tech profiting off news outlets and driving them out of business? Or is it more accurate to say that this is a desperate attempt by the leaders of a dying industry to lobby the government in order to force the best players in digital advertising to pay for the failures of everybody else? And if it's the latter, then what precedent does this set for the notion of free and open access to information? What precedent does this set for the future of journalism and democracy? To answer these questions, let's start by going through the details of the proposed legislation. In 2019, after an 18-month investigation into the anti-competitive behaviours of big tech digital platforms, the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission, ACCC, outlined 23 recommendations in a 623-page report. The report found that Google collects 47% of the digital advertising revenue in Australia, while Facebook earned 21%. As a result, one of the major recommendations was a code to govern the negotiations between Australian news outlets and digital platform giants for the use of their content. This code is now referred to as the News Media Bargaining Code. The code dictates that digital platforms and news outlets will have 3 months to negotiate deals, and if no deal can be reached, then an independent arbitration panel will be appointed to make a ruling on the matter within 35 days. The code would also require digital platforms to divulge details of any significant changes in algorithms with registered news outlets. The Treasurer has clarified that the news code would only affect Google Search and the Facebook platform. Services such as YouTube, Google Maps, WhatsApp, and Instagram would be exempt. This is not the first time that a government has attempted to compel Google to share revenue with news outlets. In 2013, Google agreed to pay 60 million euros into a French media fund in order to avoid paying news outlets directly.
The agreement will help French media develop their presence on the internet, but Google will not pay them for posting links to their content. French publishers in negotiations leading up to the deal had tried to get Google to pay them copyright licensing fees directly and for listing French headlines and article snippets in Google's search engines. France had threatened to draft legislation to force Google to pay media for posting links to their content if no deal was signed.
Then in 2020, the EU published a new copyright directive. So in April of the same year, it was translated into French law in order to force digital platforms to attain revenue-sharing agreements with news outlets. The French government gave Google a year to negotiate with media outlets in good faith. Google responded by saying that they would remove the snippets and the pictures, then give outlets the option to give consent before using these materials. In absence of consent, Google would just show the bare link to the articles. The outlets were not happy with this response, as the removal of the pictures and snippets would almost certainly reduce traffic to their news sites. Then for a short period of time, Google opted to remove the links altogether. This was seen as a show of force by the media outlets. Pierre Louet, the CEO of a major media group in France, accused Google of circumventing the law. In an interview with the AFP, he said that Google is offering us a choice between amputating our traffic, which will prevent readers from finding us, or accessing our sites via its search engine, and amputating our rights. So the outlets were not happy when Google was using their content. But they were even more outraged when Google didn't use their content. The only choice that they would afford to Google was to both send them massive amounts of monetizable traffic and pay them to do so at the same time. In February of 2021, Google signed a deal to fund 121 French news outlets with $98 million over the next 3 years. Now, let's look back at the situation in Australia. In response to the news bargaining code, Google has declared that the code is unworkable and launched a campaign against it.
In its current form, the code remains unworkable, and if it became law, would hurt not just Google but small publishers, small businesses, and the millions of Australians that use our services every day.
Facebook has implemented a ban of news on its platform.
Face off with Facebook. From the early hours of this morning, the social media giant began shutting down Australian access to the pages of major news sites, but then broadened the net to include the Weather Bureau, Fire and Rescue and Health Services.
Microsoft also joined the fray, saying that they would gladly fill the void left by Google.
Google said they would withdraw their search engine, which according to industry data accounts for 94% of the country's search market. Bing is a distant number 2 in the market. Microsoft told Reuters that its CEO, Satya Nadella, has since spoken with Prime Minister Scott Morrison. And on Monday, Morrison said Microsoft was ready to step in with Bing, with respect for the new rules.
There are a lot of numbers being thrown around about how much Google actually profits from news companies. Google has never revealed a number and has only provided estimates. This is because of the nature of how news actually benefits Google. In terms of direct profit, Google hardly profits at all from news. The vast majority of profits come from ads that are shown with what are called queries with intent to purchase. A query with intent to purchase is something like when you want to buy headphones or running shoes. So you type best headphones or cheap running shoes. People making queries for news generally do not have any intent to purchase, and therefore queries for news almost never have any ads. Additionally, Google has stated that news-related queries only make up about 1% of overall queries on the platform, and that they also don't run ads on the Google News tab.
Even though, I suppose it should be added that they have 95% of search engine queries, only 1.25% apparently relate to news.
But Google admits that they do benefit indirectly by having news on the platform. Having high-quality sources to news on the platform gives more substance to the platform as a search engine, which drives more users to the platform. But that indirect value cuts both ways. In the same way that news platforms drive more traffic to Google, Google also drives huge amounts of traffic to the news platforms as well. News sites can then monetize that traffic by showing ads and turning users into paying subscribers. If you look at it this way, you could reason that Google doesn't actually hamper the ability of news outlets to monetize their content at all. On the contrary, they may be the most absolutely vital service in terms of monetization for news outlets there is. What Google does do is, it creates a single access point where all of the news outlets of the world have to compete. This is great for a user, because it means that the user doesn't need to search 50 different sites in order to determine the best result. But it has created enormous disruption for news platforms. News platforms now need to compete with platforms all around the world. This has led to more desperate attempts by news platforms to manipulate facts in order to manufacture more compelling news stories.
Another thing we have to understand here, this was a very important emotional talking point. We saw a lot of mainstream media figures and also politicians talk about the officer that was beat with a fire extinguisher over its head until he was dead. beat bloody with a fire extinguisher over and over. Psychological kind of, operation, some people would say, to push the bigger point that look how horrible, how evil these people are. When in reality, they were caught with their pants down. They were lying about this from the very beginning. And if they're lying about this, what else are they lying about?
There is a feeling now that the purpose of the news is to push an agenda, build a narrative, and tell you what you should think.
In the old system of news, we had a group of responsible gatekeepers who could force-feed us the news they thought we should know. We trusted them because they were familiar brands with a track record. All the research about media over 100 years tells us that the media told us what to think about, but they didn't tell us what to think.
When you look at trust today, the media has pretty low trust. Companies have low trust. Politicians have low trust. So it's all about gaining trust.
To deliver on the responsibility that comes with that freedom, the fourth estate needs journalists to be accurate, credible, and most importantly, ethical.
The advent of desperate journalism has forced the people to turn to new forms of media in order to receive news. These include podcasts, TED Talks, YouTube vloggers, independent bloggers, Instagram influencers, citizen journalists, and even memes. Consumers are turning to these sources because they encourage conversation, build communities, and are based on trust. Now let's answer the questions that we posed at the beginning of the video. So, is this a matter of big tech profiting off news outlets and driving them out of business? Or is it more accurate to say that this is a desperate attempt by the leaders of a dying industry to lobby the government in order to force the best player in digital advertising to pay for the failures of everybody else? I think that the best way to answer this question is by asking two other questions. Question 1. If the traditional news outlets were to disappear, then would Google be substantially less profitable? Possibly, but probably not, because as we've discussed previously, news-related queries make up a very tiny portion of Google's overall queries, and their major forms of monetization have nothing to do with the news. In all likelihood, alternative forms of news media will surely fill the void. Question 2. If Google were to disappear, would traditional news outlets be substantially more profitable? Possibly, but probably not. Google is responsible for the majority of traffic for most of these platforms. Trust in traditional media is massively declining, and the alternative sources of news are more compelling and trustworthy. What do these laws mean for free and open access to information?
The News Media Bargaining Code would break how Google search works in Australia.
These laws would undoubtedly change the nature of search engines. If a search engine is forced to pay for journalism, then search engines can no longer connect people to the best results for their questions. Instead, only the most licensable information would be available. This may also have the unintended consequence of giving search engines more power over journalism. If it becomes their responsibility to fund journalism, then without very careful oversight, they would have the power to choose which outlets survive and which don't. It would also change the way that we think of referrals. The idea that a person or entity should have to pay in order to give a person the best information possible is fundamentally undemocratic. And our last question. What do these laws mean for the future of journalism and democracy? Journalism is absolutely vital to a thriving democracy. It is meant to be a force that holds the governments and corporations accountable. But this is only possible if it is entirely independent of governments and corporations, and empowered by the people. If a certain media outlet is incompetent, spreads lies, or engages in unethical activities, then that outlet should be reprimanded in the form of discontinued viewership and demonetization. But if these new laws are enacted, then the viability of news outlets will no longer be about journalistic passion and integrity. It will be about who can negotiate the best deals in court.
The bigger challenge will be money. How will this next journalism be financed? There will be multiple sources. It will not be as advertising driven as our journalism was before. And we will pay for more of it. Consumers will pay for more of it. 450 newspapers today charge for digital subscriptions. None did 3 years ago. For this to work, journalism is going to have more value, be more convenient, work for you in your life, so you will actually pay for it.
Traditional journalism has failed to cope with the changes in our society. It's untrustworthy, self-destructive, and instead of trying to improve, they're putting the blame on Google. Forcing Google to bail them out will only ensure that they never have to change. To set up a system where the expanding dissatisfaction of the people has no influence on the success and failure of news corporations will result in worse news, disinformation, and division. It is unwise and undemocratic.
I'd say that what we see is a crisis for old business model. There is no crisis for journalism as such. On the contrary, the interest for reporting, for people who have the boots on the ground, who use their feet, and not only Google, the interest for that kind of journalism is greater than ever.
There's a long way to go, but I believe that what disrupted the news industry will now save it, and that is you, the changing audience. The people who found Craigslist are now finding a better way to get news and are finding better news.
What's important to Australia, I think, is that we set the rules that are right for our people.
Thanks for watching. Let me know what you think of this topic in the comments. Also, we're a new channel, so please like and subscribe to support us.